You know, sometimes, you just look back at a moment, and it's like a spotlight snaps on. Everything that was murky suddenly comes into sharp, painful focus. For me, that moment was hearing Sarah call me cheap. Not just cheap, but selfish, small-minded. All because I wouldn't take out a massive loan for our wedding. And when she said, if you loved me, you'd want to give me the wedding I deserve, that's when everything just shattered. It's funny how clear things become after they've already shattered. Because I look back now, and I see it. All those little cracks that were there from day one. I just kept trying to smooth them over, pretend they weren't there. I thought I'd found someone who understood me, who even claimed to love my simple life. She said she was done with the material chaos of Seattle, tired of the rat race. But the truth was, she was never really happy with what I had to offer. And I was just too blind to see it. Where I grew up, in Ashland, people didn't really flash money around. Your word meant something. Nobody thought twice about driving a 10-year-old truck if it still ran fine. My parents taught me to save, to live within my means, never go into debt for things I didn't absolutely need. I worked in IT, made decent money, had a good chunk saved up. I was content. I owned my small house outright, no car payments, no credit card debt. Nothing hanging over my head. Some people might call it boring, but to me, that was freedom. Then I met Sarah. It was at a party my buddy Kevin threw one summer evening. She walked in, this vision in a gorgeous dress, all confidence and style. Completely out of place in Kevin's backyard where everyone else was in jeans and t-shirts. She was from Seattle, worked in marketing, and just had this energy. We got to talking, and she told me she was exhausted from keeping up with expectations. And she actually said my calm, grounded approach to life was refreshing. Like I was some kind of cold drink on a hot day. We started dating, and for the first few months, it felt perfect. She'd drive down from Seattle on weekends. We'd have coffee on my porch, go fishing at the lake, cook dinner. Just quiet. She even laughed at herself when she couldn't bait a hook. She kept saying she loved how different my world was, how lucky she felt to have found someone who wasn't obsessed with status. I remember one night, sitting under the stars, she looked at me with these soft eyes and said she finally felt like she could breathe. That was it. That was the moment I fell completely for her. The moment I thought I'd found someone who truly got me. But then, little things started happening. Small comments, here and there, that I just brushed off. She'd joke about my truck being older than some of her friends' kids. Remarks about how we should upgrade to a nicer restaurant instead of the local diner. Or casually mention her friends back in Seattle had these amazing apartments with skyline views. At first, I just thought she was making conversation. Harmless. But the frequency started increasing. She'd scroll through social media, showing me engagement rings her friends got, huge diamonds that cost more than my truck. She'd laugh and say, "Can you imagine spending that much on a ring?" But there was always this look in her eyes. A little flicker of want. I tried to ignore it. She started talking about her old life more often. The fancy dinners, the weekend getaways, the designer clothes she used to buy without thinking twice. She'd always follow it up with, "But I don't miss any of that." Which, looking back, should have been my first real clue. Maybe she did miss it. More than she wanted to admit. About 8 months in, I decided. I wanted to marry her. I'd been saving my whole adult life, and I had enough to buy a beautiful sapphire engagement ring. Her favorite gemstone, set in white gold with accent stones. It wasn't a massive diamond, but it was elegant, unique. I thought it represented us perfectly. I proposed on that same porch, at sunrise, coffee getting cold beside us. She said yes. Happy tears. That first week felt like a dream. Then came the moment that should have made me really, truly pause. We drove to her parents' house the next weekend. I was going to officially ask for their blessing, and she could show off the ring. The whole drive, she seemed nervous. fidgeting with the ring box, checking her makeup. Barely talking. When we arrived, her mom opened the door with this huge smile, pulled Sarah into a hug, and immediately grabbed her hand. I watched her mom's face change in real time. The smile falter, just slightly. Her eyes flicked to mine with this look I couldn't quite read. Her dad was more subtle. Firm handshake, congratulations. But I could feel the judgment in the air. Her mom made some comment about sapphires being interesting choices, with way too much enthusiasm. The kind of tone people use when they're trying really hard to be polite about something they don't actually like. Sarah barely showed the ring to anyone else that day. Kept her hand in her lap during dinner. Didn't post any photos, which I thought was strange. The drive home was quiet. Uncomfortably quiet. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said she was tired. But I saw the way she looked at that ring when she thought I wasn't watching. Twisting it around her finger like she was trying to imagine it being something else. That night, lying in bed, I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. Was she embarrassed of what I gave her? Was the woman who said she loved my simple life actually just waiting for me to become someone different? Someone who could give her the life she'd left behind? Here's what I should have recognized, but didn't want to see. When someone tells you they've left behind a lifestyle, watch how they talk about it. Sarah never said she disagreed with materialism, or that it was empty. She just said she was tired. That's not the same as changed. Tired means you want a break, not that you fundamentally shifted your values. And her mom's comment about the ring? That wasn't really about the sapphire at all. That was about me not meeting their financial expectations. I was being evaluated like a business investment, and I'd already failed the first assessment. The question I should have asked myself right then was, if she's embarrassed to show her family what I gave her, how is she going to feel showing her friends? Her coworkers? The rest of her world? But I didn't ask that question. Because I was in love. And love, it just has a way of making you ignore the obvious until it's too late. The wedding planning started innocently enough. Or, that's what I told myself when Sarah suggested we make a guest list. I was thinking maybe 50 people. Close family. Close friends. Something intimate. She pulled out her laptop and started typing. I watched that list grow. 50 to 75 to 100. And she just kept going. When I asked why we needed so many people, she looked at me like I'd asked why we needed oxygen. Said it would be rude not to invite her entire extended family, all her work colleagues, college friends, everyone from her parents' social circle. I did the math. Over 200 guests. This intimate celebration I'd imagined? It felt like a corporate event. She started talking about venues. Pictures of vineyards, historic mansions, waterfront properties that required year-long waiting lists. Every single option came with a price tag that made my stomach turn. But whenever I brought up the cost, she'd wave it off. We'll figure it out. Weddings are expensive for everyone. This is normal. I suggested something simpler. The community center where Kevin's sister had her wedding, or even an outdoor ceremony at the lake. Sarah's face would cloud over, and she'd get this tight smile that told me I'd said the wrong thing. She started using phrases like our special day and once in a lifetime, like those magic words justified any amount of spending. The catering became our first real fight. I found a great local caterer. Buffet style, really good food, reasonable prices, excellent reviews. Sarah looked at the proposal for maybe 30 seconds before pushing it aside. Pulled up websites for premium companies. Plated meals, multiple courses, wine pairings. The difference in cost was staggering. We were talking about tripling our food budget. But she insisted buffets looked cheap and tacky. That her family would judge us. That we couldn't ask people to stand in line at our wedding. I tried to explain most guests wouldn't care, they'd just be happy to celebrate. But she'd already moved on to talking about hiring a live band instead of a DJ. Every conversation about the wedding turned into a negotiation where I was apparently being unreasonable for wanting to stay within a budget. And she was just trying to make sure we didn't embarrass ourselves. I started dreading these planning sessions. Feeling this knot in my chest every time she said, "We need to talk about wedding stuff." Because I knew it meant another conversation about spending money we didn't have on things that didn't matter to me. Then one night, I couldn't sleep. Grabbed her laptop to check my email. My phone was charging. The browser was still open. I saw the tabs. She'd been Googling how to upgrade an engagement ring. Looking at diamond replacements. Scrolling through before and after photos of rings with bigger center stones. I just sat there in the dark, feeling something break inside my chest. She'd never said a word to me about being unhappy with the ring. Never mentioned wanting something different. But here was the evidence. She'd been thinking about it. Probably since the day I proposed. I closed the laptop. Lay back down. Couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd angled her hand away in photos. Kept it in her pocket during family gatherings. All the little signs I'd missed or chosen to ignore. That was the moment I truly realized she'd never really been happy with what I offered. She'd just been waiting for me to figure out I needed to offer more. The bridesmaid situation pushed things even further. Sarah wanted her sister Emily and 3 college friends in the wedding party. Fine. Until she announced they all needed to buy matching dresses from a specific boutique. Not regular dresses. These were custom-ordered gowns, several $100s each, plus alterations, plus matching shoes. Emily called me one afternoon, her voice tight with stress. She was having trouble affording it all. 2 kids, a mortgage, a tight budget. She tried talking to Sarah about affordable options. But Sarah had shut her down, told her she was being unsupportive. Emily said she was calling me because she hoped I could get through to Sarah. When I brought it up that evening, Sarah's response made my blood run cold. She said if people couldn't afford to be in her wedding, maybe they weren't the right people to have standing beside her. That real friends would find a way to make it work. That this was her one chance to have everything perfect, and she wasn't going to compromise because other people had financial problems. I stared at the woman sitting across from me. And I genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. This wasn't the person who'd sat on my porch talking about how exhausting it was to keep up with everyone's expectations. This was someone who was now creating those exact same expectations for everyone around her. The breaking point came when she started talking about her bachelorette party. Her friends wanted a weekend in San Diego. Clubs, beaches, bottle service. And they expected all the bridesmaids to chip in for Sarah's expenses on top of their own. Flights, hotels, party packages. Easily over $1,000 per person. Emily called me again, practically in tears. She couldn't afford it. But Sarah was making her feel guilty for even hesitating. Posting things in the bridesmaid group chat about sisterhood, about how hurt she was that not everyone was as excited as she was. I finally sat Sarah down. Told her we needed a serious conversation about money. About expectations. About what we could actually afford versus what she wanted. That's when she brought up the loan. She'd already researched it. Looked into wedding loans. Calculated how much we could borrow based on my income. And she presented it to me like it was the obvious solution. Everyone took out loans for their weddings, she said. We'd pay it back over time. Monthly payments wouldn't be that bad if we just adjusted our lifestyle a little. I felt like the walls were closing in. Like I was being backed into a corner with no way out. I told her no. Told her I wouldn't start our marriage buried in debt for one day. Wouldn't sacrifice our future for a party. That's when she called me cheap. Said I was selfish and small-minded. Asked me if I even loved her. Because if I did, I'd want to give her the wedding she deserved. She said I was embarrassing her in front of her family. That everyone could see I wasn't willing to provide for her. That maybe she'd made a mistake thinking I was the kind of man who could make her happy. Those words. They hung in the air between us. And I realized this wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about who we fundamentally were as people. And we were not the same. What was really happening here, at its core, was manipulation. Sarah had spent months slowly escalating her demands, testing my boundaries. Every time I agreed to something bigger or more expensive, it reset her baseline for what was acceptable. The guest list grew because I didn't fight hard enough at 100. The venue got more elaborate because I'd already compromised on the catering. The bridesmaid dresses became non-negotiable because I'd let everything else slide. This is how financial abuse works. It's not one big demand. It's 1,000 small concessions that add up to you losing yourself completely. And that accusation, that I didn't love her enough? That's the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. Weaponizing my feelings, trying to make me prove my love by destroying my financial stability. The cruelest part was that she'd specifically sought out someone with my values, someone stable, debt-free, because that made me a good provider. But now those same values were being reframed as character flaws. A few days later, she told me her parents wanted us over for dinner. Just a casual family meal, she said. Nothing formal. But I knew better. I could feel it in my gut. This wasn't going to be casual. I showed up knowing exactly what was coming. But nothing truly prepares you for sitting at a table while 3 people tag team you about your financial decisions. Sarah's dad started it off. Smooth. Talking about how weddings were investments in your future. How the connections you made, the impression you left, could open doors. How successful people understood you sometimes had to spend money to show people you were worth knowing. Her mom jumped in with stories about weddings she'd attended. How the modest ones were always remembered as the sad ones. How nobody forgot a beautiful celebration, but everyone forgot a cheap one. Sarah sat there quiet, letting them do the work. Occasionally nodding, like they were making excellent points she'd never thought of before. They had charts. Actual printed charts. Showing average wedding costs in our region, payment plans for loans, even contact info for a loan officer her dad apparently played golf with. I felt like I was in a business presentation about my own life. Except the product they were selling was debt and disappointment. Her dad looked me straight in the eye and said I needed to think about what kind of man I wanted to be. Whether I was the kind who stepped up for his family, or the kind who let them down when it mattered. That's when something shifted inside me. When I realized this wasn't about love, or commitment, or building a life together. This was about control. And keeping up appearances. And funding a fantasy that had nothing to do with me. I set down my fork. Looked at Sarah. Waited for her to say something. To defend me. To tell her parents that we'd figure this out together, as a couple. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just stared at her plate, like the pattern on the china was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. So, I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for weeks because I kept hoping we'd find our way back to those quiet mornings on the porch. I told them I wouldn't sacrifice my future for one day. That I'd worked too hard to build a stable life to throw it away on a party. That if Sarah needed me to go into debt to prove I loved her, then maybe we wanted different things out of this marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence where you can hear people's brains recalculating everything they thought they knew. Sarah's face went red. Then white. She finally looked at me with eyes full of anger instead of love. Her dad started to say something about me being unreasonable. But I was already standing up. Already thanking them for dinner. Already walking toward the door. Sarah followed me outside. We stood in her parents' driveway, under the porch light, moths circling above us. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told her I was pretty sure marrying someone who valued a wedding more than a marriage was the bigger mistake. And then I got in my truck and drove away. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I didn't expect. Sarah told everyone who would listen that I was cheap and controlling. That I promised her a beautiful wedding, then backed out when it came time to actually pay. That she'd wasted 2 years of her life on someone who didn't value her. Her version of events spread through her social circle like wildfire. Suddenly, I was getting messages from people I barely knew, telling me what a terrible person I was. Kevin told me to ignore it. Said anyone who actually knew me would see through it. But it still stung, to have my name dragged through the mud by someone who'd told me she loved me just weeks before. I threw myself into work. Started going to the gym more. Spent time with friends who didn't ask me every 5 minutes if I was okay. Then, about a month after our breakup, I heard through Emily that Sarah had started dating someone new. A lawyer named Mark, who apparently had money and wasn't afraid to spend it. Part of me felt relieved that she'd moved on so quickly. Maybe now the drama would finally die down, and I could start rebuilding my life. But Sarah, being Sarah, moving on quietly wasn't really her style. She posted photos constantly. Designer bags, fancy restaurants, weekend trips to places I'd never heard of. Always with captions about finally being treated the way she deserved. Mark seemed nice enough from what I could see. Always smiling in photos. Dressed sharp. The kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne advertisement. I stopped checking her social media after a while. It felt like watching a performance that had nothing to do with real life. But I'd still hear updates from mutual friends who couldn't help themselves from filling me in. Apparently, Sarah was already talking about wedding plans again. Already looking at venues. Showing off a new engagement ring that made her sapphire look like a toy from a vending machine. Friends told me she was pushing Mark even harder than she'd pushed me. That every conversation was about the wedding. About what she wanted. About making sure everything was absolutely perfect this time. I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost wanted to warn him. But I figured he was a lawyer, probably smart enough to figure it out on his own. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after I'd walked away from Sarah, I ran into Megan at the grocery store. She'd been one of Sarah's bridesmaids, and we'd always gotten along fine during the planning. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which was surprising given how Sarah had been talking about me. She suggested we grab coffee. We sat down at a cafe near the store, and she told me she'd felt terrible about how everything went down. Said she'd never really believed Sarah's version of events. And honestly, she just needed to vent to someone who'd understand what Sarah was really like. Megan told me everything. Things I never would have known otherwise. Sarah had pushed Mark to book the most expensive venue in the entire region. Insisted on a guest list even bigger than the one she'd wanted with me. Demanded a ring upgrade just months after he proposed because the first one wasn't quite right. The bridesmaids were all stressed about costs again. Sarah had picked even more expensive dresses this time, and the bachelorette party was now planned for the Bahamas instead of San Diego. But here's the thing that made my coffee taste better than it had any right to: Mark had started asking questions. Started pushing back. Started realizing that maybe this wedding wasn't about building a life together, but about putting on a show. 2 weeks before they were supposed to send out invitations, he called the whole thing off. Told Sarah he couldn't marry someone who cared more about the wedding than the marriage. And ended their relationship entirely. Megan said Sarah was devastated. Not because she'd lost Mark. But because she'd lost the wedding. Lost the chance to prove to everyone that she could have the perfect day she'd always wanted. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard that. That I was completely over it and didn't care what happened to her anymore. But the truth is, I felt vindicated. Felt like the universe had confirmed what I'd known all along. I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. A few months later, I made a decision I'd been thinking about for a while. I sold my small house and put a down payment on a bigger place. A real house with land and a view and room to grow. The kind of property I'd always dreamed about but never bought because I was saving for a future that turned out to be an illusion. I started dating again, eventually. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee and conversations with people who didn't measure my worth by my willingness to go into debt. Life got quieter, simpler, better in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or proving anything to anyone. And sometimes, late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that moment on her parents' driveway. About walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And I'd feel grateful instead of sad. Here's what I learned from all of this. And I hope it helps someone else. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And the person who truly wants to build a life with you will care more about the life you're building than the party you throw to announce it. When someone shows you who they really are, especially when it comes to money and values, believe them the first time. Those little comments Sarah made about my truck, about my house, about wanting better restaurants? Those weren't jokes or harmless observations. Those were her real feelings leaking out before she'd perfected the act. And when someone uses love as leverage to get what they want, when they tell you that proving your love requires you to damage yourself financially or emotionally, that's not love at all. That's control wearing a romantic disguise. I didn't lose a fiancé that night in her parents' driveway. I escaped a future I would have regretted forever. I escaped years of debt, years of feeling like I was never enough. Years of watching my hard-earned savings disappear into someone else's fantasy while my own dreams collected dust. The wedding she wanted would have lasted one day. But the debt would have lasted years. And the resentment would have lasted even longer. Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that disappoints everyone else, but saves yourself. What would you do if someone you loved asked you to compromise everything you'd worked for?